Our story today is taken from the book of Proverbs, chapter 13 and verse 24. Now, Proverbs is one of those books that can be both challenging to preach on and, on the other hand, seemingly very easy to preach on. The reason it's challenging is that it's not really a narrative. The book of Proverbs is what it says on the tin, a collection of proverbs. A proverb being a short, often well-known saying that states a general truth or a piece of advice. Proverbs is an example of Hebrew wisdom literature, a collection of short, wise sayings, one sentence after the other, raising questions about values, moral behavior, the meaning of human life, and right conduct. This is also the reason some find this book easy to preach on, because they don't really have to read a big passage or a longer story context. They can just pick out one of the verses, a neatly packed, wise sentence, extrapolate from the wisdom or guidance therein, and apply it how they see fit to their congregation. And in so many ways, Proverbs has historically been treated a bit like a collection of holy fortune cookies. Crack one verse open, you get a neat little saying, the job's done. But the verse we're going to be exploring today is no mild fortune cookie, no harmless little life tip. And as we'll see, the common and wrong interpretation that has hung around this verse for centuries has had immense repercussions in the real world. Proverbs 13, verse 24. It says, "Those who spare the rod hate their children, but those who love them are diligent to discipline them." This particular proverb has historically been so popular to use that it gave birth to a well-known British saying, "Spare the rod, spoil the child," meaning if you don't use the rod, your child will end up being spoiled, overindulged, and under-disciplined. This seemingly biblical value became the bedrock for what was considered biblically justifying hitting children, the physical assault and abuse inflicted on one's children, wearing the mask, wearing the label of discipline. The practice of spanking, smacking, whooping, hitting has been accepted in so many cultures by so many Christians and for so many years, spearheaded by the influence of white supremacy and colonialism. We're going to come back to this point a bit later on. Now, many interpret Solomon as saying that if you fail to physically hit your child, you are allowing them to turn spoiled, that hitting them expresses your love for them and makes you a responsible, guiding parent. Some in modern-day language might call this tough love. This interpretation fed into the Victorian-era parenting style, which has been passed down through generations, the hitting of one's children, done with one's hand, but also often done with a belt, branch, stick, otherwise called switch, shoe or rod of some sort to reflect this Bible verse. And this is not some far distant reality we're talking about. I personally know a large number of church members who will stand on that smacking or spanking is not the same as hitting, and that hitting their children is not abuse, that physical punishment is not abuse but biblical and just a part of healthy parental discipline. It must be, because the wisest man of his day said so. Well, today we're going to have a look at what that wise man was actually saying. What does Proverbs 13:24 really mean? In the days of King Solomon, the author of the book of Proverbs, shepherds carried two main tools. One was called a staff, and the other called a rod. The staff of a shepherd was a long pole like we can see here, often with a bent end at the top. We also call this a shepherd's crook, crook referring to the bowed part. The shepherd would use his staff to guide the sheep in his flock as he moved them from one place to another. It was also long enough to reach any lamb or sheep that might be straying too far from the flock, thus risking being lost or picked off by a nearby lurking predator. The staff wasn't used to hit the animals, but functioned like an extended arm to guide. Now the rod, the second tool, is a smaller object. As we can see here, it looks a bit like a club. And this tool, this was not used on the sheep, but as a defensive weapon against predators. If a shepherd met a wolf on the road, he used the rod as a weapon to beat off the predator and protect the sheep. To understand what Solomon meant by this metaphor, we must understand his context. Solomon's father, King David, was a shepherd. He worked as a shepherd in his youth before he became the king of Israel. Both David and Solomon use a lot of shepherding and sheep metaphors in their music and poetry writing. The backdrop of shepherding would be a familiar and a familial one to Solomon. So when we understand what these words and tools mean and what they were really used for, we suddenly gain a better understanding about other verses in the Bible too. Psalm 23, that famous psalm by David, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Some of us may be so familiar with Psalm 23 that we can say it from memory, and yet it is so common to misunderstand its meaning and the words used here. David, the shepherd, in his psalm, calls his Lord a shepherd, and describes the Lord using these two tools of shepherding. Your staff, in Hebrew, mishenah, and your shebet, rod. That's the very same word used in Proverbs 13:24, shebet. But notice the language. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. They comfort me. Not beat me, not hurt me, not fill me with fear, not force me into submission, not punish me. No matter what mental gymnastics we may do, who here can honestly say that they are comforted by being beaten with a rod? Who here can honestly say that would bring them comfort? It wouldn't. Now notice end of verse 4. What is the context of the Lord's rod and staff? David says, "I fear no evil." First, he is describing dangers, walking through a dark valley. But why does he not fear the darkest valley and evil? Because, the very next verse tells us, his shepherd uses his rod and his staff. And now let us recall what a shepherd uses these two tools for. With the staff, the Lord keeps David from getting lost. And here comes the crux of it. With his rod, he defends David from bloodthirsty enemies in that dark, evil valley. Just like a shepherd defends his flock from predators, the Lord uses his rod as a defensive weapon to protect David. Now, with this understanding, with this in mind, let's take a second look at Proverbs 13:24. "Those who spare the rod hate their children, but those who love them are diligent to discipline them." Those who spare the rod. Those parents who do not use their defensive tools to protect their child from predators hates their children. Those who do not defend their children from harm, from violence, hates them. Remember, the rod is not for the sheep, it's for the wolves. Now, sheep are prey animals. Any shepherd will tell you that. Sheep are prey animals. They think and behave like prey animals. If you hit a sheep even once, they will become forever afraid of you. They won't come when you call. They won't seek shelter or protection from you. They will flee from you, run away and be afraid, because their brains have been wired to remember what is a threat, what is dangerous, and what to avoid. much like humans, much like children. Prey animals have to quickly learn who and what is dangerous in order to survive. And so no good ancient Near Eastern shepherd would ever inflict physical violence or pain on one of their flock. Here we can see a glimpse of the fascinating and chilling influence, the mindset, the history of Western imperialism and colonialism, playing out even in shepherding practices. In many Western countries, shepherds utilize sheepdogs to gather and move their flocks. Why is this effective in eliciting a response from the herd? Because the dog is perceived by the sheep as a predator. And as we know, the sheep are prey animals. They run from the sheepdog, thus the flock is moved around. Western practice is using fear to move the sheep. In contrast, in many Middle Eastern countries and other non-Western countries, shepherds more typically still apply the ancient practices of guiding their sheep, namely by communicating through certain words and even singing. One word to make the sheep stop, another to make them bunch together, another to signal safety. That's how they instruct their flock where to go, how they call them. Here is a short clip that has been making its rounds on the internet. A Yemeni shepherdess films how she sings to her sheep and how they respond and follow her. You'll see the translation of the Arabic on the screen.
يا غنماتي انتو حياتي امشوا ورايا غنوا معايا.
O my sheep, you are my life, walk behind me, sing with me. Jesus, in fact, referred to this practice when he spoke of himself as a shepherd to his people and said, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." They hear my voice. Everyone would understand what he was referring to because ancient Judean flocks knew their shepherd by his voice, not by the feel of his rod. They followed his voice. Where white Western shepherding is used fear to lead the flock, the ancient Middle Eastern practice was by using trust. Now, in order to understand the next line of Proverbs 13:24, we must understand the secondary use of the shepherd's rod, and that was connected with counting. Shepherds also use this tool called a rod as a method of counting their flock. Imagine for a moment that you have a very large flock, hundreds, even thousands of animals. You've been out in the fields, and now you're tasked with making sure you haven't lost any along the way. A sea of sheep are passing quickly by you. That's physically difficult to count. So shepherds would use their rod as a fixed visual point. They would hold out their rod and have all the sheep pass under it, counting the animals as they passed into the pen or wherever they were being kept. Keeping count was extremely important because they were traveling the countryside so extensively. Anyone who has chaperoned a school field trip knows the challenges of keeping an eye on all the little ones. And so if the count came up short, the shepherd knows that he must now leave safely behind the other sheep in their pen and go into the evening and night looking for the lost sheep, hoping to find it. With this in mind, let's have a second look at the second line in verse 24. In many translations it says, "But those who love them are diligent to discipline them." But this is not a good translation from the Hebrew. The Hebrew says, "But those who love them are diligent to shakar." Shakar does not translate to discipline. Shakar means literally to look early or diligently for, to diligently seek, to earnestly look for. The same word is used in Psalm 63:1. "You, God, are my God, earnestly I seek you." Shakar. Proverbs 8:17, "I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently find me, those who shakar me." Isaiah 26:9, "My soul yearns for you in the night. In the morning my spirit longs for you. My spirit shakars, looks earnestly for you." but those who love their children are diligent to shakar them. Because as well as the rod being used for defending against predators, the rod is used for counting. The shepherd earnestly looks to make sure all the sheep come home. And now let's highlight the very obvious but perhaps missed detail here. Verse 24 is one cohesive thought. It's not two separate thoughts. Although it is formatted on two different lines in our Bible, this is one statement. The presence of the word but means that there's a continuation, a connection between the two thoughts. And so Solomon wrote, "Those who spare the rod hate their children. Those who do not protect their child from violence, from predators, from harm, hate their children." This is one type of parent. But, those who love them, those who love their children, are diligent to shakar them, to seek them earnestly, to earnestly look for them. Like a shepherd, they use their rod not only to protect, but to count. Make sure your child is safe. Pay attention to your child's needs. And if they fall behind or get lost or are in danger, go find them, carry them, help them. Now, the absolute foul mistranslation and misrepresenting of what this verse means should genuinely shock us, because it actually leads us to the opposite conclusion of what the text is saying. I recently attended a funeral. The children of the departed were giving eulogy speeches during the church service, and the common theme that these adult children had to say about their mother was that she was big on discipline. They kept coming back to this again and again, big on discipline. One of them laughed as he described his mother physically harming him, as though it were a charming anecdote. The children of the departed also made reference to their still living father. He too was apparently big on discipline. How he would have his children, who were crying, go get his belt from upstairs, that he might discipline them. And again, this was all said like a charming anecdote. People in the congregation laughed and chuckled knowingly. The conclusion by the storyteller was, "I wouldn't be the man I am today if it wasn't for my mother, for my father." As though their physical abuse, under the umbrella term of discipline, had somehow done them good and shaped the children into moral, disciplined, law-abiding citizens. This sort of language, this sort of thinking, is nothing new. Stand-up comedians talk about it. Friend groups laugh about it. The underlying trauma that so many get through by using humor and justifying it with culture, joking about their father's belts, their mother's hand, their mother's shoe. And here is where we again come back to white supremacy, imperialism, and colonialism. This is Dr. Stacey Patton. Dr. Patton has a doctorate in African American history and is an award-winning author and child advocate. Here she is a guest on a very popular podcast called The Touré Show. She was invited on the show to discuss a commonplace disciplinary action within black households, spankings.
I could hear some people saying, like, it sounds real white. And you're like,
no, actually beating a black child is the whitest thing you can do to destroy them intellectually.
Say it again.
Beating a black child is the whitest thing that you can do to destroy them psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, and physiologically. So what I talk about in my book, Spare the Kids, is I go back 2,000 years of history, back to antiquity in Europe, where corporal punishment, this ritualistic violence against children, was born. And
in Europe.
And there are white guys who wrote books about this. So, you know, when black women say this kind of stuff, nobody believes us. But I got the bibliography. So a bunch of white dudes wrote this before I was even born. And they've tracked all of this violence against children in Europe. Europeans never respected their own kids.
The pair delved into a lengthy discussion about this form of punishment and its deep roots in the history of enslavement and generational behaviors.
So why do Black people think spanking is the thing to do?
Because there's a lot of myths around it. We think it's a uniquely Black thing, that it's intrinsic to our culture, that it's something that we brought over here from Africa. Like, there are people who will argue that they took everything from us, our names, our cultural practices, our natural ways of doing things, but whipping children is the one thing that survived the Middle Passage. And so they think that corporal punishment is something that has existed since the beginning of time, and that's not true. It is a byproduct of colonization and enslavement. So colonization isn't just about land. It's about changing the way you think, the way you eat, the way you worship, how you were in natural kinship with your own children. And so the enslavement process distorted how we think about children. We think about them as property. We think that this is a religious mandate. And when you look at pre-colonial West African traditions, there's no evidence that we engaged in this kind of ritualistic violence against our kids. So the enslavement process, living through the terror of Jim Crow, state-sanctioned violence. We got the comedy. We've got ministers who preach about it.
Wait. So are we mimicking the master?
Yes, absolutely.
The slave master.
Absolutely.
Patton specifies that corporal punishment and ritualistic violence against children originated in Europe and were subsequently carried out against enslaved people, facts that she underscores heavily in her book, Spare the Kids, While Whooping Children Won't Save Black America. She explains how hitting children was never a part of history or traditional culture in African tribes or kingdoms in the past, but has been projected back into history through the lens of imperialism and slavery. Black parents learned or were forced to enact hitting their children from slave owners, from white people who lived in a society that was all about force, violence, domination of their wives, of their children, their animals, their poor. And that violent tradition that was forced on colonized and enslaved peoples soon became absorbed into these communities, because we learn from the way we're treated how to treat ourselves and each other.
Absolutely. That's the brilliance of colonization, to convince you to think that this unnatural behavior is who you are, that it's intrinsic, that there's some benefit from doing this. So Black people think, oh, I'm not in prison today because I got whooped.
What? Okay, so tell me why spanking is wrong. And remember that a lot of people are going to hear that and go, I got spanked and I turned out fine.
And I always say, think about how much better you could have been.
How much better could you have been? You'll never know who you would be if you hadn't gotten spanked.
Yes, exactly. We would have never known.
More self-esteem,
more
maybe?
self-esteem, more intellectual capacity. You would have grown up to, if you really turned out fine, you would have grown up to look at that violence and say, this didn't feel good. You would have been able to tell the truth about it, that it didn't feel like love. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel protected. I felt fear, but that you grew up to normalize it and invert that kind of domestic violence as something that was healthy and loving is a symptom, a sign that you actually didn't turn out fine.
Domestic violence?
It is. It's absolutely
Parents
domestic
spanking
violence.
Children is domestic violence.
Absolutely. It's not love.
I mean, if a man treated his wife the way that we think it's okay to treat our children, that would unquestionably be domestic violence.
Yeah.
But when you say, like, wow, even as much as your work as I've read, you calling it domestic violence feel like, wow, really? But, I mean, yeah.
It's contrary to everything we've been taught about corporal punishment. Hitting children is the only form of domestic violence that we call love and for your own good. Think about it this way. If I hit you or you hit me in this moment, somebody's going to jail. It's a felony offense. If we walk down the street and smack a dog, we're going to get in trouble for that. But hitting children, this is the only group where it is codified in law. In every state, there is a law that tells you how you can appropriately hit a child.
What is the impact on the kids?
Oh boy. So it starts very early. A lot of people start hitting like popping their kids, plucking them, things like that, when they're around 2 years old. And what happens is you're wiring the brain and turning the brain in the wrong direction. So people think that, oh, if I hit my child and I don't leave a mark on them, there's no damage. They're fine. But there are things that happen underneath the flesh that you can't see. The body is wired to go into fight or flight mode when there's a threat to their survival.
The white slave owner may no longer physically be there, or at least not in the shape they once were. But the abuse is perpetuated now by many of the descendants of those who were and still are oppressed.
That whippings are considered a legitimate disciplinary strategy that far too many Black parents use to achieve the best outcomes for their children. Such feelings and understandings about physical punishment are retroactively applied upon entry into adulthood when narratives about the merits of physical punishment have been effectively internalized and reframed as love and protection. Ladies and gentlemen, corporal punishment is the only form of domestic violence that gets inverted as love.
This is Derek Goburn. He is a neo-soul and funk musician who wrote a song called There Goes Another One. The song explores the topic of how normalized physical abuse towards children is, with the chorus line going, "Keep your hands off that baby, keep your hands off that child." He began to share this song online and dancing to it in the hopes of spreading the message to a larger audience and raising awareness on this topic. And his efforts were featured in Rolling Stone magazine. It is unbelievable how many comments he gets from people online justifying and mentally bending over backwards to defend hitting children, defending it with scripture, with culture, with tradition. The most common complaint he receives is spanking isn't hitting, and he often responds to these comments with the line from his song and dancing. This is Zoe Tyler. She aims to inform people about the twisted thinking behind hitting children and the forced humor which this has taken on.
No, because me, I'm beating my kids the second they talk back. Bop, bop, bop. Making Massa proud. What? Making Massa proud. What does that even mean? No, I was just saying, like, you were continuing his family tradition of beating black bodies into submission. No, beating kids is funny. We were all just laughing. I bet you they were beating kids in Africa too before anybody got there. Well, there's actually no historical or anthropological evidence of ritualistic physical discipline in pre-colonial West African societies, so you'd be wrong. No, it's not even about all that. Like, they say it's okay to do it in the Bible. You know who else used that defense? Nah, you made it weird. You gotta go. Oh. Well, I'll just say this. In 30 years, after your children have been born and you've done what you say you're gonna do, and you go to them and you say, why don't you talk to me anymore? And they bring up the fact that you beat them over spilling juice or getting in trouble at school. I want you to remember this moment where you sat here, and when you fantasized about your future children, instead of being at their games and recitals, instead of walking them across the stage at graduation or down the aisle, you fantasized about holding them down and beating them. So you can tell them you didn't want to do it. You can tell them you did it out of love. You can tell them it hurt you more than it hurt them. But I want you to remember that you sat here and you fantasized, practically salivating over the very idea of it. And you laughed.
This is Jamal Cannon. Jamal is the founder and executive director of The Block, a sports-based education nonprofit using the sport of boxing to provide academic and social resources to Chicago's youth. As a child, Cannon fought frequently, got suspended from school, arrested, and given a court order for anger management. For years, he has worked at The Block to support juvenile offenders and children with behavioral difficulties. He too speaks extensively on the direct connection between hitting one's children and their emotional dysregulation and struggles.
Kids who get whooped are more likely to act out aggressively towards their peers and show higher rates of antisocial behavior. Cognitive and academic performance is shown to be lower in kids who experience corporal punishment. Corporal punishment is linked to high rates of anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem in children. You are an adult who believed that you had to be hit to learn as a child. Had another tool been used consistently in accordance with your behavior, you likely would have seen the same result, because the fact that you changed due to corporal punishment shows that you had the ability to think forward and make decisions based on your best interests. Young people motivated by many things. There's mastery, belonging, avoiding a negative, pursuing a positive, shame and pride. Your parents just chose fear and pain as a lever they'll pull. People who believe that corporal punishment worked for them are like people who grew up using a shoe for a hammer, looking at all the beautiful things that they built. Just because you managed to get by with that tool doesn't mean it was the best tool for the job. And you walk funny. Correction. We all walk funny.
I didn't expect anybody to admit to child abuse in my comment section today, but let me show you this. I explained why I believe corporal punishment is domestic violence, and Veronica Johnson here replied with this, explaining that kids need violence when they get out of line, sharing that she slaps her kids, chops them in the throat, punches her kids in the arms and thighs, she hits the smallest with a back scratcher. Notice that these are all choices meant to inflict the most amount of pain on kids without leaving any scratches or bruises. This is a tactic of child abusers. And she's unapologetic about her violence. She says her children are grown up to be amazing people, as if we're supposed to trust her assessment on what an amazing person is. A lot of you are seeing this and saying, I agree with corporal punishment, but she just takes it too far. And that's because you're focused on how or where or what she hits her kids with. And I'm focused on the fact that she hits her kids. With any misbehavior, there are dozens of nonviolent ways to respond. We choose violence because we haven't built the necessary skills to correct the misbehavior, or because violence is emotionally satisfying to us. It is not in the best interest of children to be hit when they're wrong, just like it's not in our best interest to be hit by somebody physically and politically more powerful than us when we make a mistake. Hitting children leads to the most temporary and shallow behavioral change of all methods available, and it's on us as parents to find better ways, or else we just sound like this. I think often the way adults behave with their kids in public is to appease other adults instead of acting in the best interest of their children. There's a people-pleasing that comes from being raised with a punitive hand. When my son was 15 months old, we took the train downtown to see the Bean. As a Chicago native, he has to go there at least once and then pretend to hate it for the rest of his life. While we were on the train home, he got mad and cranky and loud out of nowhere, and everybody on the train is staring at me. But there's one person in particular who's shooting daggers through me, like, do something before I do. I can't figure out what's wrong with the boy, and I try to comfort him, and when I do that, dude starts shifting in his seat and shaking his head at me. It felt like 5 minutes in, but it might have been like 30 seconds. My son looked at me and said, eat? Oh, I forgot to give him a snack. So I gave him a snack and he calmed down. When I pulled the snack out of the bag to give it to him, the man was angry. He was flustered that I was giving the kid what he needed. He didn't see the response from me that he wanted to see in that moment, because what he wanted to see was vengeance. Never mind that I gave my kid what he needed. Never mind that it actually worked to quiet him down. He needed to see pain brought onto my child. And that's what people are usually talking about when they talk about disciplining kids. They need to see pain and punishment. And I could have done that. I could have yelled at my child. I could have hit him. I might have shocked him into silence, but it would have taught him so many negative things about himself and how to behave that would have done us more harm in the long run. I feel like people wanted me to yell at or hit my child for yelling on a train, and that just doesn't make any sense to me.
There is an ocean of scientific proof and evidence that hitting one's children, and yes, spanking is hitting, has lifelong detrimental effects on those children, ranging from internalized shame to spanking triggering early puberty, rage, addiction, personality disorders, social challenges, depression, eating disorders, long-term illness, weakened immune systems, verbal and communication difficulties, fear-based views of God, trouble emotionally regulating, criminal and violent behavior, anxiety, and stunted neurological development. All the studies on this topic say the same thing. Hitting children leads to trauma, not better behavior. Child psychologist and psychotherapist Haim Janot writes, "When a child hits a child, we call it aggression. When a child hits an adult, we call it hostility. When an adult hits an adult, we call it assault. When an adult hits a child, we call it discipline." The history of hitting children is a long one. For hundreds of years, parents have hit their children, calling the abuse physical discipline, using Proverbs 13:24 and similar proof texts as a biblical defense for their actions, even some believing that this is what God determines to be part of good parenting. Tough love is needed sometimes. Millions of parents have actively brought harm to their children, physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Meanwhile, what Solomon was saying was the complete opposite. Protect your child. Keep your children from harm, from violence. Don't you harm them. This verse 24 actually contains a lot, because it's a warning against the full spectrum of child abuse. Child assault on the one hand, and child neglect on the other. Don't harm them, and don't neglect them. Seek them earnestly. We must sit back and let this bombshell hit us. That misunderstanding and misuse of this single verse has led millions of parents to becoming the very predators that the text says loving parents must protect their children from. They become the very harm they were meant to shield their children from. They become the predator, become the threat. First of all, the Bible has been hijacked for hundreds of years by abusers and slave owners. With this and other verses used to justify treating other people as subhuman and justifying our violence towards them as a kind of mercy. Many of us uphold this tradition. The same white people who interpreted this verse to support hitting children used other verses to support slavery and racism, misogyny and xenophobia. Many, perhaps even people we know, still try to word their way around what's actually happening. And by this, you can sense the shame. There is a feeling of shame behind something when you can't even call it what it is. It's spanking, not hitting. I'm not hitting my child, I'm popping them. I'm not hitting my child, I'm disciplining them. Stop being so sensitive. It isn't that deep. You really are the snowflake generation with all your talk of gentle parenting. It'll just lead to your children being out of control and undisciplined. Children need a firm hand to guide them. But on the other side of all this are some fantastic and remarkable people. People who are actively unlearning colonialism's evils, who are deconstructing what has been cultural traditions for generations, who are learning and implementing gentle parenting, which is simply good, loving, respectful parenting. Pioneers who, despite what they grew up with, are leading the way towards the kind of good parenting that the Bible is really talking about. If you're one of those people who are struggling, dredging through the thick mud of that process, well done. Well done. It's very, very hard work, but it's important that we do it. The evils of white supremacy and imperialism still stain and haunt our theologies, our methods of interpreting and applying Bible verses, still poisons our cultures, our homes, our families. It runs so deep, it has its hook so deeply embedded in our thinking that it's easy to be blind to them. So much of what we call our culture is in fact the remnants of violence of white supremacy and slavery. So much of what we think is ancient and wholesome practice is in fact no older than the not-so-old racist white supremacy, and have been absorbed into our perceived identities and handed down from father to son, mother to daughter, generation after generation, until we might think that these ideologies are ancient, biblical, godly. But in white and Asian and black homes, many are continuing to inflict on their own families and communities the very abuse and dehumanizing and oppression which colonizers inflicted on their families. And so the question now becomes, will you be a cycle breaker? Will you be the one in your family line to say, no, it stops with me? The abuse, the hitting, the misuse of these biblical texts, the twisted thinking about what good parenting is, it stops with me. My children will never be treated as I was. I will put in the work, the time, the pain, the discomfort, the effort to unlearning the things that were normalized to me growing up, the things that I thought were right for the longest time. I will not excuse the evils wrapped in the justification of culture and tradition and history, and it's just always been this way. I'm going to put in the work to unlearn them and learn new and better things. Who will decide I will hand down better things to my children? Who will have the open-mindedness? Who will have the courage to break the cycle of abuse? Who will take this new knowledge and choose instead a better way, to guide their children by being trustworthy and emotionally safe spaces, not with threat, to bring up their children with gentleness and wisdom, not with fear, to use their rod to protect them from the threats and predators that lurk among them in their families, in their schools, in their church, yes, even the predatory parental traditions that lurk in our cultures. Who will have the courage to choose to be a good shepherd to their children? Because according to Solomon, those who fail to protect their children hate their children. If we fail to protect our children, even from us, we hate them. But those who love them diligently look out for them. Those who fail to protect their children from abuse, yes, even that normalized, romanticized, joked about, minimized, downplayed, long applied, generational, culturally acceptable abuse, hate their children. Will you be the one to spare your children from yet another generation of abuse? Do not spare the shepherd's rod. Protect the child.
research. There's so much potential in our churches to have us heal and create safe sanctuaries for children, to do child development courses in those classes. But we have to interrogate how we came to this religion, and we must purge some of the toxic elements out. How many of y'all know this man? W.E.B. Du Bois. So I want to close by leaving you with his words. My fellow advocates for change, all the beautiful people in this room, I'd like to close by inviting you to reflect on these prophetic words of the great civil rights leader and child advocate, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. He said, in the treatment of the child, the world foreshadows its own future and faith. All words and all thinking lead to the child, to that vast immortality and wide sweep of infinite possibility which the child represents. So, beautiful people, what does this mean? This quote underscores the profound truth that the way we nurture and safeguard the minds and bodies of our children today shapes not only their future, but also the destiny of our world. We often hear people say children are the future. They are our right now. We must reject the notion that beating and breaking children is an effective civil rights strategy that will keep children safe, disrupt the prison industrial complex, and lead to liberation. If whooping children was so effective, then we would be at a different place in our communities. Hitting children serves no other purpose other than perpetuating cycles of pain, trauma, and poverty. I want to leave you with this last powerful reflection. As we navigate the complex terrain of childhood, we must always remember that childhood is about surviving adults. Say it with me, childhood. Oh, that is so weak, y'all. Let's try it again. Childhood is about surviving adults. The question, ladies and gentlemen, we must ask is this: do we want to be adults that children merely survive? Or do we aspire to become adults who nurture, protect, and empower them to thrive and shape a world that's safer, more just, and filled with boundless opportunities? The choice is ours. And it is our choice that carries profound implications for our children and the future they will inherit. Thank you so much.
If you'd like to learn more or read the scientific sources for the harms of physical abuse of children, you can find a list of useful resources in the description box below.